Welcome to the Grayzone. It's Max Blumenthal. Under the direction of Secretary of State Marco Rubio and President Donald Trump, the U.S. regime has enacted a massive military show of force in the Caribbean, directed against Venezuela and its socialist-oriented government. Under the dubious pretext of so-called narco-terrorism, the U.S. military has attacked 7 small boats so far, killing dozens with no legal justification. Among the dead are 2 citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, whose families are now demanding evidence that they were involved at all in the drug trade. Even as her own citizens are executed at sea, Trinidadian Prime Minister Kamla Persad Bissessar has enthusiastically supported the U.S. strikes and endorsed its looming war for regime change in Venezuela. To discuss the U.S. militarization of the Caribbean and efforts throughout the years to resist it, I spoke to one of the most important labor leaders and progressive activists in Trinidad, David Abdulah. On October 16th, Abdulah helped lead a protest outside the U.S. Embassy in Port of Spain, part of a series of actions throughout the region demanding an end to Washington's violent onslaught. David Abdulah, political leader of the Movement for Social Justice and member of the Executive Committee, the Regional Assembly of Caribbean People. Welcome to the Grayzone.
Thank you very much for having me, Max. Great to be interviewed by the Grayzone once again.
Yeah, it's great to see you again. We met in 2022, I believe, in Barbados, at also momentous time, and we interviewed you then. And I think many of the comments you made to us then portended the current situation in which the U.S. is determined to fracture regional integration in the Caribbean and destroy the independent states that have resisted for decades. And I wanted you to talk about your recent action. I believe it was October 16th outside the U.S. Embassy. It was a protest led by the Assembly of the Caribbean Peoples, and it was an International Day in Defense of the Caribbean. Tell us about this action and what kind of impact you sought to have on local and regional politics.
Yes, thanks. Yes, the Assembly of Caribbean People, the Regional Executive Committee, met quite some time ago, sometime in end of August, and to discuss what was beginning to develop with the massive deployment of military assets in the Southern Caribbean. And we decided to issue a declaration demanding that the Caribbean remain a zone of peace and that there should be no military intervention. And we circulated that and asked people to sign on to it. And we have gotten well over 500 persons signing on to that declaration. But we also indicated that we would have an appointed day, an appointed date, on a regional day of action. And we eventually decided that would be the 16th of October. And so here in Trinidad and Tobago, as a member of the Regional Executive Committee and one of the founding members of the Assembly of Caribbean People, we held a press conference outside the U.S. Embassy. It was really across the road from the U.S. Embassy, but the U.S. Embassy was very visible behind us. And other representatives of civil society organizations and some concerned citizens of Trinidad and Tobago attended that press conference. The media was there in significant numbers, and we reiterated our position, also called on the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago to withdraw the position that she has been taking, that the Caribbean is not a zone of peace, and her support, calling on her to withdraw her support for the U.S. military intervention in the region. We were hoping to have had actions right throughout the region. I have had reports on that day, the 16th. I have had reports that there were activities in Grenada. There was a protest in St. George's, the capital of Grenada. There were statements issued by organizations from St. Lucia, from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Barbados was to do something. I think they were a little bit late. Dominican Republic had a press conference, and there were activities in a number of other Caribbean territories. St. Martin, one of the members of this One St. Martin movement, had dedicated his radio program that day to this issue of the Caribbean being a zone of peace. So Jamaica had a joint statement from a number of organizations, and also a picket or a protest activity outside the U.S. Embassy. So that really, I think, began to set some things in motion. That was Thursday, and on Saturday, CARICOM finally, after many months, issued a statement, which all CARICOM member states, with the exception of Trinidad and Tobago, reiterated the position that the Caribbean should be a zone of peace, which is a long-standing CARICOM position. So I think the actions that we took helped to spur the CARICOM heads into some form of action. The People's National Party, which is the opposition party in Jamaica, also issued a statement. I think it was on Friday or on Saturday. So there's been a bit of a development of a momentum on this question, and this has been important in light of what took place at the White House on the Wednesday, the day before we had our day of action, because it was on the Wednesday at the White House, as you know, that Mr. Trump said quite openly that he's sending CIA operatives into Venezuela, and senior administration officials admitted, while not necessarily by name, but they admitted that the plan is regime change in Venezuela. So the timing of our day of action, we didn't know that would have come out in the New York Times on the Wednesday, but our timing for the day of action was fortuitous.
Well, I want to talk to you about your prime minister and the zone of peace a little bit later, but I just wanted to cover a few details. There was this attack in Las Cuevas where I believe 2 Trinidadian citizens were killed by the U.S. military on a fishing boat. Their families deny that they were drug dealers. Who were they? What are you hearing about who they were? Could they have been migrants? And even if they were drug dealers, do most people in Trinidad and Tobago favor the death penalty without trial for them? I mean, what is the public reaction?
Yeah, well, they were on a boat that was hit by one of the U.S. military drones or whatever, and the boat was blown up. And now the U.S. claims it took place in international waters. We have no evidence as to exactly where that boat strike took place. It wasn't close to Trinidad and Tobago. It was Las Cuevas is a village on the north coast of Trinidad, so it wasn't at Las Cuevas, but one of the men was from that particular area. So the families of the men said that they were fishermen, but that they had been out of the country for quite some time. They had gone to Colombia and were trying to get back to Trinidad, and they, according to one of the family members, they hitched a ride on a boat that was coming back into Trinidad. Now, we don't know exactly what they were up to, because there are people who are fisher folk, but who also engage in smuggling and this is something that has been going on for years, because Venezuela is so close to Trinidad, not on the north coast, but on our west coast. Some of the fishermen there fish in Venezuelan waters. Venezuelan fishermen sometimes come into our waters. There's movement of people backwards and forwards, and there's been smuggling going back 60, 70 years. People would have been smuggling, illegal whiskey and alcohol. So there's always been an illegal trade going historically. You have to recognize that there was a migration of Venezuelans into Trinidad as part of the supply of labor on our cocoa estates. And so the older Venezuelan community here is known as the cocoa pioneers. In other words, they came as part of that. And a lot of our cultural traditions, we're coming up towards Christmas, and one of the staple foods for Christmas are pastels, which of course comes out of the Venezuelan culture. And the music at Christmas time is the parang, which comes out of Venezuela. So we've had that migration. There was a much earlier migration of indigenous people going back many, many hundreds of years. So there's been that movement. There have been Trinidadians and other people from the English-speaking Caribbean that went to work in Venezuela, in Maracaibo, in the oil fields and so on, that have been living and resident in Caracas. I myself once went to Venezuela and got picked up at the airport by a Trinidad, well, more than once, right? Two occasions by Trinidadian taxi drivers. These guys were born in Trinidad, but they've been living in Venezuela. And on the first occasion that happened, he moved me around with some other Trinidadians who I knew, and we visited Trinidadian homes. But these are people who have been living in Venezuela for decades and so on, and are completely integrated into Venezuelan society. So there's been that movement, but there, in the last 15, 20 years, the issue of drug trafficking has been a problem. And so when you hear that these guys were across in Colombia or Venezuela, the family said they were working there because to get income. We don't know the actual facts, and I'm not going to speculate and say they were innocent of anything, of any criminal activity, or whether they were guilty of any criminal activity. But regardless of what they were doing, you cannot summarily execute them. You don't just kill people like that. Even in warfare between two nations that have officially declared war against each other, if you capture enemy soldiers, enemy combatants, you can't line them up against a wall and execute them by firing squad. That's a war crime. And therefore you cannot, kill people on the high seas. It's clearly a crime. The way to deal with persons who may be engaged in illegal activity is to stop the vessels that they're on, arrest them if they're engaged in illegal activity, if there are illegal items on the vessel. You take them to court, you have evidence, you charge them, they're convicted, and then they do the time. That is what has been the rule, and that is the rule of law, and that is what is supposed to happen. We have, of course, had a wave of migrations from Venezuela starting around 2018 because of the sanctions that were placed on Venezuela. And so there were a lot of persons who came into Trinidad and Tobago illegally, some legally, but most of them illegally. And at one time, they were allowed to register, and that enabled them to work legally in Trinidad and Tobago. Many of them did not register, and the period for registration by the government ended. There was one extension, and then it wasn't extended after that. So there are many persons here who came in illegally. Some have been trafficked, and so there is human trafficking as well. And all of these things have to be dealt with, but in accordance with law and things like that, and not by way of summary execution on the high seas. That's illegal.
And with these attacks, I mean, we also saw an attack on a Colombian boat that was displaying a distress signal. It had basically kind of floated into the zone of U.S. targeting. Do you think the U.S. is widening the scope of conflict beyond Venezuela, deeper into the Caribbean? Trump just threatened Colombian President Gustavo Petro yesterday. Will this spill over?
Well, the Colombian president about 3-4 weeks ago issued a very important statement when he said that any attempt at military intervention in Venezuela, regime change, will destabilize not only Venezuela, but all of Latin America, particularly the northern part of Latin America. Obviously, he was speaking about Colombia as well. So there is a serious concern that there can be an impact depending on what the U.S. does. Here in Trinidad and Tobago, there is also concern that if there's a war next door, if the U.S. was to attack Venezuela and create another period of great instability and insecurity for Venezuelan citizens, then there might well be another wave of migration into Trinidad. And that has implications for Trinidad and Tobago in terms of our capacity to provide employment and social services and other things for them. So that can destabilize any military intervention in Venezuela. Will destabilize not only Venezuela, but other countries in the Caribbean as well, and of course Latin America.
It's kind of ironic. The most anti-immigrant administration in modern history is enacting a policy that's almost certain to generate a massive migration wave. I guess most of it would go north. your prime minister, Kamla Persad Bissessar, has endorsed not only the Juan Guaido presidential scam, which was an effort at regime change starting in 2019. She's now fully supportive of the U.S. military show of force in the Caribbean against Venezuela. Why is she taking this position? And I suppose her party is taking this position as well.
Yes, I mean, the fact that she is taking what the position she's doing now, you're right, is consistent. I mean, not good consistent, bad consistent, but is consistent with her position going back to recognizing Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela, which of course was a farce, but it was part of U.S. policy, and therefore she supported the Lima Group that had been created. There were a couple of Caribbean countries, CARICOM countries, that got caught up in that Lima group when Trump invited some of the heads of government of CARICOM at the time to meet with him at Mar-a-Lago. And so he handpicked those who would have supported a U.S. policy position. At that time, the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, he lost the election subsequently, but so St. Lucia was a member of the Lima group until the government changed. And then you had, I think, the Bahamas, Guyana at the time, and maybe one other, Haiti, because of Haiti's precarious situation. So you had that division within CARICOM, and that manifested itself at the OAS as well, where these CARICOM countries took positions in support of seating Juan Guaido's representative at the OAS Council, which was, a complete farce, and it was based upon a falsehood. But yet, the then Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, was complicit in that political machination. And so Mrs. Persad Bissessar aligned herself in that direction, probably thinking that that is the way in which Latin America and the Caribbean would go. But of course, since then, things have changed, quite apart from President Maduro consolidating his political strength in Venezuela by many elections, not just one, but there were elections for governors of states, there were municipal elections, elections for parliamentarians, quite apart from the presidential elections, and all of which the PSUV and the grand poll of other parties aligned with the PSUV won. It meant that politically then he was able to consolidate political power. But the economy of Venezuela has also significantly improved in the last few years. So some of the problems that Venezuelan citizens were experiencing, and they were experiencing great economic difficulties at a personal level, quite apart from the economy nationally being bad, but at personal household level, people were experiencing great difficulties. And it was that which Guaido and the right wing and the intensification of the sanctions by the US against Venezuela, the seizing of the assets of PDVSA, the Citco company in the United States, and other assets and so on. All of that was putting a squeeze on Venezuela, and therefore the things were difficult. And it was in those moments that perhaps she thought that everything would go to the right, that Juan Guaido would in fact be able to effect regime change, and that in terms of Latin America, because Bolsonaro was in government at the time, and so on. So there was definitely the right wing was more dominant at 5-6 years ago, but that has shifted. In Honduras, you had a progressive person, Xiomara Castro, winning the elections in Honduras. You had Lula winning in Brazil, and so there have been shifts, because the dynamic in Latin America and the Caribbean is a dynamic. There's an ongoing struggle between left and right, between progressive forces and reactionary forces, and far right and neo-fascist forces as well. In the Caribbean, St. Lucia, there was a change in government there, and so on. So in that circumstance, what she has therefore done is essentially to double down on her position. Now, I think that part of her calculation, and I could be wrong, is that with Mr. Trump in government, and when he won the election, she was very effusive in her congratulations. In fact, she said that Biden was too woke and went too far in one direction. With DEI, imagine that she thought that Biden went too far with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And she said Trump was what the United States needed, what the American people needed. I don't know that the people who demonstrated No King's Day agree with that, but anyways, so she clearly had a position on the right in support of the kinds of policies of Donald Trump, not just internationally, but even internally. And, you know, yes, that she made that statement before she became prime minister. And yes, leaders of parties and leaders of governments routinely congratulate incoming leaders of governments and so on. And they, you know, wish them well and so on, but you don't endorse necessarily the policies of that party or leader in its internal workings inside its country. You don't criticize the outgoing leader for their policies, not when you are, you know, supposed to be one of the national leaders. So that was clearly a signal of the direction she was going in. So it's no surprise position that she took when the U.S. Military deployed troops. And, you know, she actually called for the U.S. to sanction Trinidad and Tobago. And our then Prime Minister, Dr. Rowley, when Delcy Rodriguez visited Trinidad and Tobago during COVID. And Mrs. Persad Bissessar claimed that the plane that Vice President Rodriguez came to Trinidad on was a sanctioned plane, sanctioned by the U.S. Of course, unilateral sanctions, which are illegitimate because you can't unilaterally impose sanctions like that. It's not consistent with any UN decision. So because the plane was sanctioned, she said that Trinidad and Tobago should then be sanctioned and so on. So an appeal to the U.S. Embassy here and so on. So her foreign policy has been consistently bad.
So the Prime Minister, Persad Bissessar, when she was in the opposition, called to sanction her own country. I mean,
that is correct. And when she made that statement, I issued a statement on behalf of the MSJ saying that she was a fifth columnist.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the definition of a fifth columnist. Can you place Prime Minister Persad Bissessar and her party in the context of U.S. and Western attempts to undermine regional integration and sovereignty in the Caribbean and internally prop up their business allies and yellow unions inside countries like Trinidad and Tobago?
Yeah, the UNC is primarily supported because the politics of Trinidad and Tobago, the party politics and electoral politics is largely based on ethnicity. So we have had two main parties. One of them has changed names over time, but essentially appeals to the same ethnic base. And so her party, United National Congress, and its antecedents generally get their support from the Indo, namely Asian Indian population, and the People's National Movement generally gets their support from the Afro population in Trinidad and so on. And then Tobago's politics is slightly different because there's a Tobago nationalism, and the UNC doesn't participate in Tobago's politics. So the Indo population, their political leadership, has at key moments not necessarily been strong on regional integration. Not at all times, but at certain key moments has not been strong on regional integration. And part of the reason for that is that they see Trinidad and Guyana and Suriname, those are the three countries that have significant Indo-based populations. Guyana and Suriname actually have larger percentage populations of Indians than Trinidad has. But they would see regional integration in the context of Jamaica, Barbados, and the small islands, even though they're small in population. But when you add them up, that the Afro-Caribbean population is greater than the Indo-Caribbean population. And so there's a certain reticence about aspects of regional integration. Now, this does not make sense. I mean, she came out with a statement Trinidad and Tobago first. Something like America first. So she said Trinidad and Tobago first, which is okay if you understand that Trinidad and Tobago's largest export market for our non-hydrocarbon sector is the CARICOM market. So, I mean, you were in Barbados when you saw me, 3 years ago. And when you go into a supermarket in Barbados, the majority of the items that are there that are not coming out of the US or out of the UK or wherever are manufactured in Trinidad and Tobago. Breakfast cereals, juices, and other things like that. Mayonnaise and ketchup and all those things, soft drinks and so on, are manufactured in Trinidad. Household detergents are manufactured in Trinidad and Tobago. So really and truly, Trinidad and Tobago first also means that you have to have a strong relationship with CARICOM. It makes no sense to weaken your relationship with CARICOM. And when she was prime minister between 2010 and 2015, she made a statement which was quite offensive to other CARICOM countries, because Trinidad and Tobago historically, because our economy was stronger than the others, used to provide a certain amount of economic support for the CARICOM countries. And she said Trinidad and Tobago is not an ATM, not an automatic banking machine, which you could put your card in and get cash out. And that was quite offensive to CARICOM countries. And it took a while for the relationship between Trinidad and Tobago and the rest of CARICOM to be restored. Now, in this context, and CARICOM issued a statement on Saturday, the 17th of October, first statement by CARICOM, and they reaffirmed the position that CARICOM should be a zone of peace. That, however, Trinidad and Tobago reserved its position. So once again, you have seen Trinidad and Tobago taking a different position from the rest of CARICOM. And this is not good for the whole process of regional integration, because CARICOM individual member states are not strong. We are small island states. Economically, we are not powerful. And of course, militarily, we are even weaker. But as CARICOM, we can speak with the voice of 14 member states in the bodies like the OAS or the United Nations. So as a block of countries, we have a significant voice, and that becomes important in international affairs.
Right. The Caribbean states alone can be easily isolated and exploited by their powerful neighbor to the north. But together, it's a very large population with enormous human potential, lots of resources, industrial power, as you said, oil. Trinidad has a lot of oil. So this has been sort of the clarion call and the essence of CARICOM, which was formed in, was it 1974 to
73? Yeah.
73, to pool together all these resources is regional integration. Can you talk just about the history of attempts to integrate and the U.S. role in pushing fragmentation through initiatives like the Lima Group or the coup of Jean-Bertrand Aristide in Haiti, and maybe address, where you think the future lies for this CARICOM initiative?
Yeah, well, the initial driving force for Caribbean integration, West Indian integration, because we were talking about English-speaking territories in the Caribbean, came in the 1930s and 40s by the radical workers' movement, rank and file workers' movement, that demanded that there be no adult franchise or the right to vote without self-government or independence, and no self-government without federation. So that the rank and file workers' movement in the 30s and 40s saw the viability of democracy, right to vote, in being in the context of independence, but that independence would be viable in the context of federation, of West Indian integration. Now, that agenda was then implemented in a partial way by the British at the end of the 50s, but not with the radical approach that the labor movement had. So the British did not want a strong, united federated, independent West Indies. So we were still colonies, so we were a colonial federation, and that had its own problems that it broke up. And then we had countries becoming independent in 62, Jamaica, 6th of August, Trinidad and Tobago, 31st of August, 62. And then subsequent to that, Barbados and Guyana, and then the others followed. Now, when the first four became independent, we then had what was known as the Caribbean Free Trade Area, or CARIFTA. So there was still an attempt for economic collaboration between the newly independent countries. And then CARIFTA gave way to CARICOM with the Treaty of Chaguaramas. Chaguaramas is significant because it was a former US base given to it when Trinidad was a colony during the Second World War by the British. And so there was a whole sense of nationalism in Trinidad and Tobago for Chaguaramas. And the first federal capital of the West Indian Federation was supposed to be Chaguaramas. So there was a symbolism about removing an American base given to it by British colonial power as the identity of Caribbean integration, West Indian integration. And so the Treaty of Chaguaramas established CARICOM, and then the revised Treaty of CARICOM went further to create the Caribbean single economy and market. So this has been very important, and the weakest point of integration was many years ago in October, after the assassination of Maurice Bishop, Jackie Kreff, and others on the 19th of October in 1983 in Grenada, which ended the Grenadian Revolution when they were martyred, when they were assassinated. And that destroyed the Grenadian Revolution. And a few days afterwards, on the 25th of October, with the connivance and support of CARICOM heads of government, Eugenia Charles of Dominica, Tom Adams of Barbados, Eddie Seaga of Jamaica, and others, the US invaded Grenada, when other CARICOM heads were seeking to have a CARICOM intervention in Grenada, not military, but a political intervention that would have seen Bernard Cord and Hudson Austin and the others who had effected the assassination of Bishop and others, to see them step down from power and to have a transition to another form of democracy in Grenada. And a number of CARICOM governments, George Chambers of Trinidad and Tobago, George Price of Belize, Lyndon Pindling of Bahamas, and Forbes Burnham of Guyana opposed or were for that CARICOM initiative. And while they were meeting in Trinidad at the Trinidad Hilton Hotel in a special summit, emergency summit, Eugenia Charles and Seaga and the others were talking to Washington and backstabbing their CARICOM colleagues. And that divided CARICOM very badly, because Eugenia flew out of Trinidad, went to Washington and stood at the side of Reagan to give legitimacy, quote unquote, to the invasion by the US. And that deeply divided CARICOM. And it took about a decade for CARICOM to get back a sense of coherence and a drive forward. And this is another moment. So that was the worst moment. And then, of course, you had the Lima Group and so on. And then you've now had this situation. But Trinidad and Tobago is more or less standing on its own, although Guyana is vacillating, as is Jamaica and as would Haiti. The coup d'etat against Aristide did not have that same divisive effect, because the majority of CARICOM would have stood with Aristide and sought to have him return to office.
And I know the oil union in Trinidad and Tobago also was very outspoken against that coup.
Yes, I was one of the leaders of the Oil Fields Workers Trade Union during that period. Yes, the trade union movement historically has taken progressive positions, as they did in 1983 in support of Maurice before he was assassinated. I don't have time to go into all of that detail now.
Yeah,
that'll be a story for another conversation. But yes, we the unions historically have taken very strong progressive positions. Now, at this moment, a number of those unions, including the Oil Fields Workers Trade Union, are in this coalition of interests with Mrs. Persad Bissessar and the UNC. So their voices are much more muted and nuanced at this point in time around the issue of the Caribbean. They have said, yes, the Caribbean must be a zone of peace, but their positions are more nuanced. And that is why, as the leader of the MSJ, we are taking the lead, and the Assembly of Caribbean People is also out front.
Right. And can you talk about the zone of peace and explain what it means? This was declared by CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, in 2014. What were the implications of this declaration, and how can they be asserted now against the U.S. military show of force?
Yeah, and I got something just today from a mutual friend of ours, Ambassador David Abdulah of Barbados, who traced, and I was not aware of that, who traced a resolution, well, the history of the zone of peace, to a resolution um, that was put forward at the OAS by the People's Revolutionary Government of Grenada, led at the time by Maurice Bishop, of course. And that resolution, which was passed by the OAS, identified the Caribbean as a zone of peace. I mean, I'm just going to try and get the quote accurately for you. Um, this is what the OAS resolution of 1979 that Grenada successfully piloted through the OAS resolved as follows. I'm quoting: to express its deep concern over the heightening of tension in the Caribbean sub-region resulting from the recent increases in military activity in the Caribbean area, to repudiate the concept of the region or any of its sub-regions as a sphere of influence for any power, to stress its support for the principles of ideological pluralism and peaceful coexistence, which are essential to the peace, stability, and development of the region, and four, to call upon all states to recognize the region as a zone of peace and to devote all their efforts in appropriate regional and international forums to the advancement of this concept. So it goes back to 1979. I wasn't aware of that, or if I remembered it at the time, I certainly forgot it. But after that, there was a very important address by Errol Barrow in 1986 as Prime Minister of Barbados to the CARICOM heads of government, where he stated, and he quoted Eric Williams, who had died by that time, and Eric Williams' speech about the colonial and imperial agenda that our region has experienced over the years. And Errol Barrow said that we must be a zone of peace. That was 1986. So there's been a long tradition of CARICOM countries saying that we must be a zone of peace, which predates the CELAC resolution in, when was that, 2006, 2007, or 20, or after that, whenever it was.
2014, yeah. I think.
2014, yeah, sorry, 2014, yeah. And CARICOM has passed resolutions for the region to be a zone of peace. Subsequent to 1986, at a number, I don't have all the details, but at a number of CARICOM heads of government, you will see in their declaration references to the zone of peace being a principal policy position of CARICOM.
That's fascinating. I want to ask you about something that's happened without much fanfare that I don't totally understand, in light of what the Trump administration seems to be doing with Venezuela, which is pursuing regime change through force. At the same time, they've issued a license through the Treasury Department permitting Trinidad and Tobago, through the Shell Company and their partners, to negotiate the development of the Dragon gas field, which is in Venezuelan waters. And it allows discussions formally with Venezuela's PDVSA, the state oil company, through April 2026. So how is this happening while the U.S. is essentially seeking to destroy Venezuela's economy through a naval blockade?
Yes, so several things. The previous government had, over a number of years, negotiated with Venezuela for Trinidad and Tobago's national gas company, with the operating company being Shell, to produce gas from the Dragon field. Now, this was important because that gas, as you correctly said, that gas field, the Dragon gas field, lies 100% in Venezuela territorial waters, and therefore required Trinidad and Tobago to get Venezuela's agreement that the gas could be extracted and pipe pumped into Trinidad to be processed in Trinidad in our processing plants, ammonia, methanol, LNG, and then a certain amount of the value of what was processed would have to go back to Venezuela. Now, when sanctions were then imposed by the United States on Venezuela, it meant that if Trinidad and Tobago, either the National Gas Company or Shell, being a multinational, attempted to pursue that agreement with Venezuela, we could then get sanctioned by the US for engaging in economic activity with Venezuela. So the Trinidad and Tobago government, the last one, negotiated a OFAC license. It's a Office of Foreign Assets Control license from the US Treasury, negotiated a license that would have enabled the actual production of gas from Dragon by the National Gas Company and Shell. So, and the terms of that OFAC license that was negotiated by Trinidad and Tobago with the US, those terms were okay with Venezuela. In other words, the Venezuelan government said, all right, and there was backwards and forwards negotiation. So the initial terms of the OFAC license did not satisfy Venezuela, and then the government renegotiated terms with the US and got them amended to the point where Venezuela said, okay, we will allow Trinidad and Tobago to produce the gas. Now, what that meant is, because you see, the US does not want any financial benefit of that gas production going to the Venezuelan government. So you have to find ways and means now of having Venezuela benefit from its gas, its wealth. It's their gas, their wealth, without the US saying you've gone too far. So there was some delicate negotiations. What then happened was that shortly after Trump came into office, he canceled the OFAC license that the Biden administration had negotiated and had agreed upon. And the Persad Bissessar government, in fact, she herself, the day she was sworn in or the day after, said the Dragon gas thing is dead. We're no longer looking at that. We're looking at gas from Grenada, Guyana, Suriname, which gas doesn't exist right now right away. So lo and behold, she then gets an OFAC license from the Treasury Department, but it is not to produce gas, which is the previous OFAC license. It is to enable Trinidad and Tobago and Shell to now negotiate with Venezuela. Venezuela has already given us a 30-year license, but they will not allow that production unless they benefit in a tangible way. And we do not know what the terms of this OFAC license are. In other words, are those terms saying that you could only negotiate with Venezuela in such a way that Venezuela gets nothing out of it, or very little? In which case the Venezuelans will say, no, go to hell. You can't come into Dragon and so on. So that is what that new license is. Now, it can be possibly that Mrs. Persad Bissessar figures that her support for the US military deployment and her support for Trump in so many other ways will enable Trinidad and Tobago to get an OPAC license. But then you also have to negotiate with Venezuela. And if she has been at verbal war with Venezuela and supports what the US is doing against Venezuela, then I don't know how Caracas is going to treat with the Trinidad and Tobago government favorably to allow Trinidad and Tobago to produce gas out of Dragon. And that it is not only Dragon, but there are two cross-border fields, the Coquina Manikin and the Lorraine Manatee fields. Now, those fields, cross-border, means that there's a gas field under the sea, but the field is wider than within any territory. So the territorial border of Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela splits those gas fields. What Trinidad and Tobago was able to do was negotiate with Venezuela to produce the gas on our side of the border. And the Venezuelans said, okay, produce on your side of the border. And up to a certain volume, which is your volume under sea, that is in the Trinidad side of the field. And those cross-border fields may also now be in jeopardy in terms of non-production, given the relationship between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela now. I'm sorry to have taken so long, but I try to explain for your viewers who need to understand some of the details of these matters.
No, it's interesting. It's always been confusing to me how, the US can issue licenses to Chevron as well to refine
Yes.
oil in Texas and at the same time, wage economic war on Venezuela. Um,
Yeah, and I could tell you why, Max. Because the US Gulf Coast refineries were always designed to refine heavy crude oil
right.
coming out of Venezuela, which is why Citgo had so many refineries in the Gulf Coast. And so the given the energy policy of Trump, where he is shifting away from renewables of solar and whatever, then they do need those Gulf Coast refineries to be operating at, at peak production. And the only way to do that is to get crude out of Venezuela. And so they needed Chevron to produce the crude. It's as simple as that. And
Yeah.
of course, Chevron being an American company, Chevron had some weight in the White House, and it benefits Chevron, it benefits the states, but it also benefits Venezuela as well, because Venezuela does get some benefit from that.
Yeah, it's contradictory, but sort of understandable in that light. There was this report circulating in the US and through the New York Times, and I don't know how much stock I put into it. It looks like it could have been planted by US intelligence that Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro had offered Trump and the US the whole store. You can have access to our minerals and all kinds of deals on oil, and we'll kick China and Russia to the curb, and you can have it all as long as you stop pushing for a regime change. And I don't, again, I don't know if that's true, but it's left a lot of people wondering what Trump and Rubio really want in Venezuela. And I do think that there is an ideological component that transcends the resource grab, the naked resource grab, which we know is at play here. And it's that Venezuela has really been sort of an engine for the progressive forces in the region, across the Caribbean and across Latin America. And it's sustained Cuba, which has also been sort of a, a central node in projecting soft power towards progressive forces. So, I mean, do you agree with that assessment that there's something broader here that's about destroying Chavismo? And can you address the role that Venezuela has played in projecting soft power through the region in support of the left?
Yes, certainly. So I agree. I think, in fact, I think there's a differentiation between Trump and Rubio in
Yeah.
terms of the policy objectives.
Rubio would
Um,
be obviously the more ideological one.
that's right. And Rubio, I think, wants regime change in Venezuela in order to also weaken Cuba,
Yeah.
because one of his prime objectives, obviously, is to end the Cuban Revolution. He has a fixation with that coming out of the community of Miami that he does. And that also means Nicaragua. And so I think that Rubio is driving that agenda in one direction. Trump may very well be prepared to make a deal. Now, I'm sure that Maduro understands that, and therefore is also prepared to make a deal. But he's not going to give him the whole kitchen sink and the kitchen cupboard. I can't see President Maduro selling out all of the sovereign wealth and assets of Venezuela
Right.
in order for him personally to stay in office. I can't see that. I can't see his party, the PSUV, accepting or allowing that either. So
Like privatizing PDVSA, something like that would be off the table.
I certainly would think so. But there could be arrangements that could see, the U.S. getting more oil out of Venezuela to meet U.S. energy needs or whatever. I could see, those kinds of arrangements could well take place. There were agreements with respect to the returning of immigrants, Venezuelan immigrants in the United States to Venezuela, and Venezuelan planes, as sanctioned as Venezuela is, were flying out of the United States, picking up Venezuelans and bringing them back to Venezuela. So it wasn't as if there was an absence of, of any kind of dialogue or engagement. In fact, the president had a special envoy to Venezuela. I don't recall his name now, but a special envoy to Venezuela. Then just 2 weeks ago, abruptly.
Richard Grinnell.
Right, Grinnell, that's right. And then about 2 weeks ago, Trump said, okay, no more of that. We're finished with that kind of thing. So I suppose the Rubio line might have been echoing more loudly in his ear in terms of regime change than trying to enter into some kind of agreement with Venezuela. So we will wait and see how those two different tendencies, if they're separate, I'm just surmising at a distance, but assuming there are two tendencies, which one of them becomes dominant and at which point in time, or whether they are the same, one and the same in terms of their objective. But I certainly do think that the regime change in Venezuela will have major implications for Cuba and Nicaragua, negative implications. And Cuba is under extreme pressure right now in terms of the sanctions, the blockade, and also the listing of Cuba on this fictitious list of countries that engage in this state sponsorship of terrorism. The Cuban economy is really being strangled a lot, and Cubans are facing grave difficulties. And so, we have to, as we are focusing on Venezuela and extending solidarity with Venezuela, we have to equally do so with Cuba at this point in time. Now, Venezuela, over the years, under President Chavez initially, did have a major outreach to the Caribbean countries. There was PetroCaribe, which enabled Caribbean countries to purchase refined oil products, gasoline, and so on, at a market price, but they got a significant discount. And that discount then, as they didn't actually pay the market price. The market price was what the transaction took place, but they didn't pay the market price. They paid market price less a certain amount, a subsidized price. And that subsidized price, the difference was to be repaid by the Caribbean countries in other goods and services. So they could have sold to Venezuela other goods and services. The Cubans, for example, would have provided a lot of medical services and so on to offset the difference in price. Other CARICOM countries would not have had that capacity. So there is actually officially a debt to Venezuela around the PetroCaribe arrangement. Trinidad and Tobago did not participate because Trinidad and Tobago at that time, we had our own refinery producing our own refined products. And I actually was trying to get the Venezuelans to think about indirectly, because I didn't have a direct line to them at the time, but indirectly to think about Trinidad and Tobago being part of the PetroCaribe arrangement by having Venezuela supply crude oil to the Trinidad refinery, which was state-owned, and then Trinidad and Tobago refining the products to send to the CARICOM countries. And Trinidad would then have, Venezuela would have paid Trinidad a refinery throughput fee, processing fee. So our refinery would have benefited. The CARICOM countries would have still got the refined products at the price arrangement with Venezuela. So they would have gotten it at their price. So it would have been a win-win-win, a three-way win, but that didn't work. And so Trinidad and Tobago was out. And actually Trinidad and Tobago lost as a result of PetroCaribe because we lost part of the CARICOM market, which was our refinery market. But that is water under the bridge. And then the other thing that Venezuela and Cuba did was the Operation Milagro, where thousands of CARICOM citizens were flown by Venezuela to Cuba for cataract and other eye surgeries at the Cuban hospital that deals with the treatment of eyes and so on, ophthalmology. And thousands of Caribbean people benefited from that. And there were other things, of course. Cuba, of course, has done a huge amount and continues to do a huge amount in terms of scholarships at university level for Caribbean citizens, CARICOM citizens, and other, the Cuban medical brigades, which continue to operate throughout the region. And the US actually sanctioned some officials, a government minister in Grenada, because of the role that they have played in making the arrangements for the Cuban medical brigades, health professionals to operate in Grenada, and they have threatened to sanction other CARICOM government officials and technocrats, public servants, public officers, with sanctions as well if they're involved in that. So there's been ongoing solidarity, of course, between CARICOM and Cuba, and CARICOM and Venezuela as well.
Well, David Abdulah, thank you so much for this fascinating look at the history of the region and your analysis of the current crisis. Before we close, is there anything else you want to add?
Not necessarily. I'm sorry. I hope you didn't pick up too much extraneous noise. There's some work going on at my neighbor's house next door, so I hope you weren't picking up that extraneous noise and disturbing, affecting badly the conversation that we've had. No, we've covered a lot of ground, and just to say that we appreciate all the work that you are doing, Max, and on the Grayzone, and making information and analyses available to wider and wider audiences, because we have to push back against the dominant narrative, which itself is coming under question, because even on US mainstream cable stations, MSNBC, CNN, they're raising questions about what the military is doing in the Southern Caribbean, and the boat strikes and the killing. They've said those are extrajudicial. So I think the more the message gets out and people understand the reality, the greater the solidarity will be built. That is what is necessary to prevent or to stave off or to give second thoughts to those in Washington who might be thinking or planning any kind of regime change in Venezuela or in any other country. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And absolutely, it's amazing to see all these corporate networks and corporate Democrats suddenly start to raise questions and introduce resolutions in the Senate opposing this regime change gambit when they supported it just a few years ago. But we've always been consistent in opposing regime change, understanding where it was going and the disastrous implications. We've been consistent at the Grayzone. And I think, in a time of so much deception, disclosure is a revolutionary act. So that's what we're committed to. And we really thank you for your help in getting this information out in such an articulate way. David Abdulah, political leader of the Movement for Social Justice and member of the Executive Committee for the Regional Assembly of Caribbean People. Really appreciate you joining us at the Grayzone.
Thanks a lot. Solidarity forever. And the words of Maurice Bishop, we are in nobody's backyard.